Welcome to Crossing Face. I'm John Pinna, and today we have a really amazing guest, Mr. Scott Horton, who is a director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director of antiwar.com, and has his own podcast, The Scott Horton Show, as well as an author who's written a number of books. One is called Enough Already, which is about the war, ending the war on terror, and then most recently Provoked, about how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in the Ukraine. So I appreciate you being on. It's really thoughtful for you to take the time.
Thank you very much for having me. Good to be with you.
Yeah. So, we had a little pre-conversation, and I always do the same sort of shtick about how, the podcast was formed and who we are and what we're about. And I just, we have a lot of our listenership was very interested in gaining perspective on really America's motivations and obviously the wars that have ensued as a result of American foreign policy. And so you and I are operating at the two different beaches of the same pond. I'm one of those shadowy figures in the Beltway, with 1 foot in the Beltway, 1 foot overseas, and you have a lens on the military industrial complex, on U.S. foreign policy, and in various administrations. And I don't know if a lot of people made comments about me shaving my beard. I always had my beard because I operated in Muslim majority countries. That was my thing. And I always said the beard protects me more than PPE. And so I've just shaved recently and sort of came out into the light with not only the podcast that's some years old, but then
So
having
you're DOD or CIA?
so I worked for the civil society funded by the Department of State and the DoD and other NGOs. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So all of the organizations that I operated in were funded by the U.S. government in one manner, shape, or form. And so a good example is the American Islamic Congress, which was funded by state, AID, DoD, and other agencies, was a shares core responsibility for the Arab Spring. So Dalia Ziada, who worked for the American Islamic Congress, was one of the organizers of Tahrir Square. We disseminated information all throughout the Middle East, have regime change throughout the Middle East, and so yeah, I've been almost 32 years in the national security space. Yeah,
It
and then
sounds like I should be interviewing you.
no, no, I'm overjoyed and excited to.
Well, I have a lot of questions specifically about Egypt, in fact, but I guess that'll just have to be a different
Well,
show. So go
what's the
ahead.
question about Egypt? I operated in Egypt it was really the Arab Spring years, so 2009 to 2015. Yeah,
Jeez. Well,
during the regime change there, which was funny. We had a lot of crazy stuff happening because they were shutting down all the NGOs after the Arab Spring had happened, and then obviously the only entity that we were very good at instituting change, but then the so what and what now didn't happen. So, and that was one of the critical points where saying, well, what happens when we do overturn governments? Who's gonna take over? And they've said, well, that's not your lane. Stay in your lane. So we didn't know what was going to happen. But I said the Muslim Brotherhood is the only entity that's capable of taking over the government. Does anybody consider that? And everybody's like, no, that's not going to happen. that was
jeez.
yeah.
Well,
It's
so
crazy times. Yeah, yeah. And then they and
yeah.
then and
No,
then
we
and they got all
should.
the NGOs.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. No, honestly, like if we go down that trail, I could just spend the rest of the show asking you about that specifically. So let's not do that. I'll just have you on my show and we'll talk about that.
Happy
Let's
to.
talk about what
Happy
you
to.
wanted to talk about, and then, but we're gonna catch up on what you know about all that because I'm extremely interested about it and wrote about it, but obviously don't know nearly enough.
Well, yeah. So maybe I'll couch a question to you about your most recent book. So the idea of Provoked. I've been saying, sort of personally and professionally, that everybody wants to kind of rekindle the Cold War, and so I looked at your book and I go, what's this guy? Is he? It was such a shocking because it's just right out there in the open. I have a pin that says, "Great story, show me the data," and you really get into the meat and potatoes of why our government is doing what they're doing, tied to the military industrial complex, tied to other motivations. And so I sent a briefing document right before the war. This was like December, right before the war started, the invasion started, to Jake Sullivan, and it was a bluff document, a bottom line up front document, and it said, let's just go with neutrality. Let's just do it the same thing they did in Austria back in the 50s. Why don't we just do that? And his response to me was, conventional wars in Europe are over. That was number one. Number two is sanctions are going to work. And the third thing was that I am operating under antiquated thinking. And I said, but they're Krasnodar. They have all these. They have armor ready to roll, and even if they don't take Kiev, they have the capability of a prolonged war because they're Russia, and that's how they play. And so my question to you, sort of setting the stage, that is this idea of revamping the Cold War? Does it have the feeling that is it like a religion? Is it religious in nature? Is it part of like the construct of who America is? It's like we need to have an enemy. We need to have this sort of atheist or this sort of secular enemy that's out there, and we need to come in as the savior. Is there a religious component to this as you see it?
Maybe. I mean, first I should apologize for cursing on your religious show here,
It's
but
okay.
you
No,
talk about Jake Sullivan, the swears come rolling out. Uh Look, I'm not that smart, man. Honestly, like the guys who are like the real students of the ideology of American empire, like Klaus Rin, or these
right,
guys who are like, they're like real deep thinker guys. Like, I'm a names and a dates guy. I can bludgeon you to death with the facts until you admit that I'm right, that these guys are in the wrong, and they're the ones who started the fight and all that. I think that yes, there is of course a mix in American culture between Yankee do-gooderism,
right,
Southern born again evangelical commitment to Zionism. You have just overall Scotch Irish like to get drunk and fight. And I'm only telling on my own people here. I'm allowed to be racist like that, I guess, because I'm Scotch Irish in a sense. Um, but it's just part of that culture is like, would you call me? I'll kick and so
right,
then, yeah, so that plays into it, of course. And then, of course, is all the corruption in banking and media and in the military
sure,
industrial complex and all of that. And you have that whole thing from Upton Sinclair about people like believing what they're paid to be wrong about and stay
sure,
wrong. You know what I mean? And so, if you look at like Iraq War II, you have this massive conspiracy of interest. And it's so clear, especially if you hated that thing at the time and knew better all along at the time, and not just like, oh, as a liberal Democrat, but say, for example, like an anti-war.com guy. And you
right,
can just see this is being led by W. Bush and his men in the White House and
sure,
Cheney's select crew of neoconservatives and Bill Kristol's, axis of evil inside the newspapers and magazines. They are
right,
just making this happen. And the rest of the national security establishment is like, oh, geez, are we doing? I guess we're doing this, right? That's the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institution, and like
yeah,
the guys who weren't exactly the neocons were
yeah,
like, oh, and even at the Pentagon and at the State Department,
right,
why are we attacking Iraq? We're doing Iraq now? What? Huh? It was very much the parade was being led by the top. This was not like the consensus of all the bureaucrats that like, of course, we must preempt Iraq before they attack us with weapons of masses. Like, what a bunch of crap.
I know,
It was Richard Pearl and Bill Kristol and their lying Israeli spy friends who did that to us, who
right,
manufactured all that intelligence and made that war happen. And you could see how, and especially from out here in Texas, I could see how it was like a gray scale. You could see how people went from understanding that it was not even the Taliban, but it was bin Laden that did it to,
right,
well, I guess it was the Taliban that did it. And then I guess Saddam Hussein helped them. I guess that explains how the Taliban would have done it, would have been if Saddam Hussein helped them. It's just people are just
sure,
rationalizing this. As one
right,
guy said to me in my cab, come on, man, cab driver, know it all. If Saddam Hussein didn't do 9/11, then how come we're attacking them then?
right, right,
Right? It's all built into the thing, the
yeah,
presumption of this thing. And so, um, and what was George Bush's motive?
right,
The thing was, he had told his father, you should go all the way to Baghdad because you want to be in the middle of the war so you can get reelected. And then
Sure.
his father did not take that advice and then got unelected. And
Yeah.
so this room temperature IQ idiot who got one little prediction, political kind of examination right in his life, that became his entire way of looking at things. And
Sure.
as he told his biographer, Mickey Herskowitz, while he was still governor of Texas and they were like writing his campaign book, he said, when I'm president, if I have a chance to attack Iraq, I'm going to do it. Because to be a great president, you have to be a war president. That way
Sure.
you can make sure to get reelected and get your agenda done in your second term, which was, of course, his failed attempt to privatize Social Security. He's going to take all the Social Security IOUs and put that in the stock market bubble, the same one that crashed in '08. Remember that? That
Right.
was his big legacy that he was going to achieve. But you gotta start an aggressive war against Iraq so you can make sure to get elected so you can privatize Social Security. That was supposed to be the Bush presidency.
Right.
Just
Right.
yeah. And they say, oh, Mickey Herskowitz lied about that. But Mickey Herskowitz was not like some tabloid kook. He was a mainstream historian and biographer. And after that so-called controversy, Bush Jr.'s father, former President H.W. Bush, hired Mickey Herskowitz to go ahead and write the biography of his father, Senator Prescott Bush. So obviously, the father didn't think that this guy was a no good, dirty liar who slandered his son as launching a premeditated war of aggression for his own idiot, narrow-minded, short-sighted political, not even ideology, but just his conception of his needs. Right?
Right.
It's called Rove's War from his point of view.
Well, but it worked, right? They got their
It did
war, got a
work.
second term. I
That's
mean,
right.
we're I was just listening to oh God, it was Scott Harris, and he was or Sam Harris, and he was talking about how all, Muslims are really the problem, and he was chatting about all this stuff, and I go no one put the brakes on him, but it was really funny. He was saying, well, Muslims don't protest against terrorism. Muslims don't protest about this. They protest about the prophet, about pictures and things like that. And I was, I'm a Muslim, so, but I'm also a Shia and a Ismaili. I don't know if you know what they are, but we're like Islam after hours. We're a small sect in Shiism, so we're kind of the hippies of Islam. And so I sitting there going, yeah, but he kind of glosses over and is very reductive when it comes to like kind of the wars and the siege that the Muslim community has been on because of this interventionism. And when I talk with some of my military friends, they still say it right now. They go, we need Israel because Israel is a beachhead for us in case we need to slap down the Saudis or the Iraqis or whatever it is, even though we never use it as a beachhead. And then the next step is they say,
They
well,
use us for that.
what's that?
They use us for that,
They
attacking
use
Iraq
us,
and
yeah.
beating
And so
Israel.
and so we need it as a beachhead. And then my good friend of mine who is a West Pointer. We were chatting back and forth, and he goes, well, what do you think the policy should be for the Middle East? I said, well, I don't know what the policy should be, but I know what it is. I think it's peace through chaos. I think it's as much chaos that we can cause and generate as much revenue as possible, which as someone who's like defended the republic, I get it. We have a war economy. We need revenue. We need this. We need that. We need all these different things. But is it really working for the American people? And I think the answer is no. And I think that's the crux of it.
Yeah, it's like Madoff's pyramid scheme. Yeah, he
Yeah,
needs more people to buy into the thing, but
right.
the word need is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. This is not what's good for the society overall at all. It's good for the national government and its connected cronies at the
Yeah,
expense of all of the rest of us. And of course, Israel is at the heart of all of this because if you look at the doctrine of chaos in the region, it
yeah,
comes from American neoconservatives who were
yeah,
writing particularly for the interests of Israel. And people make a big deal about this because they should. It's the
yeah,
clean break doctrine. And it became famous at the time, just not famous enough. But it was David Wormser and Richard Pearl and also Douglas Feith and a couple of others. But it was really David Wormser who was the principal author of the thing and who later became Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor. And
sure.
he founded the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group to come up with lies about Saddam and Osama, same guy.
Right.
And what he said was, forget Oslo, forget a two-state solution for Palestine. We want to kill those people and steal that land.
Right.
The problem with that is if we're not willing to make peace with our neighbors and we want to throw out Oslo, I mean, because it was a Netanyahu fan who had murdered Yitzhak Rabin, you'll remember. So now
Right.
this is Netanyahu coming into power for the first time in 96. And Wormser's writing this to Netanyahu.
Sure.
Since we're
Yeah.
throwing out the two-state solution, we got to figure out what we're going to do about the Shiite alliance of terror and power from Tehran through Damascus to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon.
Yeah.
That is the arc of danger against Israel. And so to neutralize that, we need to focus on getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Now, that sounds stupid to you because you know the first thing about what the region was like then and what became of it since.
Yeah.
And the thinking here was completely ridiculous. And I think you'll probably be able to verify I'm right about this part.
Right.
David Wormser says that we'll just give him a Hashemite king. And any Shiite will be magically hypnotized and obey the will of the Hashemites because the Hashemites claim to have the blood of the prophet. And the Shiites have to do whatever they're told by anyone who claims to have the blood of the prophet. And in my understanding of this, and that I've learned from Shiites and other religious scholars and political historians and actual history that I've read about all this, that's completely stupid and wrong. And that Shiites don't venerate the Hashemites in any way whatsoever. Their claim of divine blood means absolutely nothing. And the Shiites of Iraq had a fatwa against the Hashemite king when the British foisted one on them previously and helped overthrow him in 58. And that the only reason David Wormser believed this was because the Iraqi Shiite swindler Ahmed Chalabi, who was sponsored by Iran, and who was the Jordanian bank embezzler, convicted con man, and who had lied to the CIA about how his men were ready to do a coup in 1995 that led to that whole catastrophe in the Clinton years there. That was the cause of the CIA putting the burn notice on him. This is when that guy, Robert Baer, was run out of the CIA for going along with Chalabi on that one. And so, but then the Pentagon hired him. All the neoconservatives at the Pentagon said, this is the guy who well, first of all, he sold all these lies to David Wormser and Richard Perle and Paul Wolfowitz and the neoconservatives in the 1990s. And then this was the same group that then Dick Cheney hired to run the government in the W. Bush years, and who after September 11th swung right into action. And they used the Iraqi exiles' lies about weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda, stovepiped all that right up to the vice president's office and to the president, even claimed the ridiculous lie that, of course, originated with the Israelis, that they had observed the Iraqi foreign minister, Al-Ani, meet with Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker in Prague in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, as Dick Cheney insisted on continuing to call it. And even, guess what, handed him a flask of anthrax. It just so it was a coincidence, see, that Israeli spies happened to be at the cafe that day and saw this happen. They told the Bild in Germany, and you can read that. The Bild record is gone, but you can still read an article about it in the archives at the Los Angeles Times. If you just type in Los Angeles Times, Mohammed Atta, flask of anthrax, you'll see that that was what the Israeli intelligence liars were telling the media and trying to get that war going, ginning that thing up from the very beginning. And they pushed all those lies, and that was who got us into that war. And of course, what happened was America, yes, installed the Shiite supermajority in power in Iraq. And then they have been in the tightest of alliances with Iran ever since, and told George W. Bush, don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And all of Chalabi's promises to David Wormser that the new Shiite Iraq, that Ayatollah Sistani would force Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran and start being friends with Israel instead, and that the new Shiite Iraq would build an oil pipeline to Haifa like the good old days and all that, that was just a bunch of crap. And he was lying to them. And not only are they traitors who are serving Israel's interests at America's expense, but they're stupid. And so they were actually serving Iran's interests at America's expense in the name of trying to help Israel. Now, the rest of the history now makes more sense, I think, to people when they understand that W. Bush was not trying to empower his regional rivals, the Iranians, in Iraq. He
Right.
believed, because the neoconservatives told him so, that we
Yeah.
would be dominant over them and then they would be dominant over the Iranians. It
Right.
just did not work out that way at all. So
Yeah.
then, and everyone ought to look this up. It's so much fun to read. It'll drive you crazy. It's called The Redirection. It's in
The
the New Yorker
redirection.
magazine from March 2007. And it's about how this is before Barack Obama ever came to town. This is how the neoconservatives, Elliot Abrams and
Yeah.
Zalmay Khalilzad, came to Bush and said, "Sir, we screwed up. We are now fighting a civil war for the Shiites we hate.
Right.
And we can't stop and put Saddam back in power. His lynching is coming up in a week here. Remember when they hanged him?
Yeah.
All the guys chanted Muqtada, Muqtada, Muqtada as they lynched him, right? So we totally screwed this up. So now we have to do the redirection, which means what? Means we tilt back toward the Sunnis.
Right.
Zalmay Khalilzad met with the Saudi king in the beginning of '06, and the king said it used to be us and you and Saddam against Iran. Now you have given Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. You idiot. What are you going to do about it? And Zalmay Khalilzad said, yes, Your Highness, Your Majesty, sir, we're going to fix it. Sorry, you're right, but we're going to fix it. And so what did that mean? That meant backing bin Ladenite suicide bomber, head chopper murderers to invade Syria and call
Right.
it a revolution and try to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. That was why they knew that they had scored what in soccer they call an own goal. Oops. With
Right.
Iraq War II. We put
Yeah.
Iran up 2 pegs in Baghdad. Now at least we could try to take them down a peg in
Right.
Damascus, which, as Wormser said, Syria is the keystone in the arc of Iranian power. Now, America at Wormser's behest, America just completed that arc of Iranian power and added Iraq to it. So
Yeah.
now we try to take Syria out of it. And so that was the entire reason that Barack Obama backed Al Qaeda in Syria from 2011 through really the end of his presidency. Even after it blew into the Islamic
Right.
State only ruled far eastern Syria and western Iraq. The guy
I,
still loyal to Jilani and Al Qaeda, who now happens to be the ruler of Syria as of a year ago,
right.
they were still in the west of the country, and Obama continued to back him through the end of his presidency. You might even remember it wasn't until the summer of 2017. America had gone to war against ISIS back
Right.
in 14,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
wasn't until the summer of 17 that Trump, not Obama, Trump finally called off CIA support for Al Qaeda in Syria.
Yeah.
And the Washington Post headline says, in move sure to please Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump calls off support for rebels in Syria. They accused him of treason
Yeah.
for stopping funding Al Qaeda, suicide bomber, head chopper, murderer, terrorists.
It's nuts. It's nuts. I remember it was maybe 2013, 2014. This is maybe an admission. This is a meeting that may or may not have happened, but I remember being in DC and being called to a meeting at oh God, it was the Hay Adams, and we're in the basement of the Hay Adams, and there's 3 characters that were brought in. I call them characters because they were from the Saudi government, and they basically had these really shady, really tenuous connections to being able to take over as a royal connection to Syria. And they said these are the people we're thinking are the best candidates. And this was for once the regime changed. And I scratching my head and I'm going, does anybody recognize these guys? I was like, and of course I was there with a few of my Arabic friends and stuff like that. We were chatting back and forth, and I go, is this a viable? Are they just bringing these guys in the room, or is it something viable, or is it just nonsense? Because I don't know the exact lines, but this is the type of conversations that were happening in 2014-ish when it comes to Syria, and it was just a funny moment. I remember on the Hill we had the Syrian diaspora saying, as soon as we get regime change, everything's going to be fine. And all these religious minorities kind of getting up there and saying, well, we're not really sure about that. Like we're just not really sure. The indigenous Christian communities and so forth. And then we have something like that's going on like now, where we have the regime change has happened in Syria. Obviously, these are presumed enemies of the state, meaning the United States, but they're in charge now. They're talking a big game about how wonderful they're going to be, and I deal in the religious freedom space, and now we have these sort of letters going to the White House that are talking about how um, this is what needs to happen there religiously. There needs to be religious pluralism in Assyria, and so they're talking about the Druze, and they're talking about some pocket conversations of Alawites, but they're not talking about the indigenous community, religious communities there. And so as a result, and they're defining the smallest religious minority as evangelical Christians. So imagine that. I mean, you're Texan, right? So imagine you drop 200 evangelicals there, and they start to convert, and as a result, you say that, well, may not be indigenous, but they're the biggest religious minority, and therefore they need to be extended the rights the protections from the U.S. government as a religious minority in a foreign in Syria. Imagine that, displacing indigenous peoples. I mean,
Yeah.
these are the issues I'm dealing with now.
You're talking about American born again Christians are moving there right now?
Yeah, they're parachuting in, and then, like I said, instead of used to
Good
be.
luck to them, man. I hope they're wearing leather collars like a old Marine in the Philippines.
Well, they would, yeah.
Wouldn't
I mean,
be
and that's the
there.
thing. I mean, they're there, but there's also extended the protections of the U.S. government while they are there. So it's a little bit of a bait and switch about whether or not there may or may not be martyrdom. But I remember some of these conversations in 2013, 2014, and this regime change, and where they were actually talking about people that may take over the government. And I go, I don't see the Saudis being able to pipeline a someone that's going to be acceptable to the Syrians, and they lasted this long. I mean, they lasted till just recently.
Yeah.
I mean,
And it was, I think it was the only time in history that you could, or one of the only times in history that you could say that the sanctions regime really worked. Usually it just backfires and empowers a regime over their own people. But in this case, it decimated the entire country, the entire population, up to and including the regime, where everybody was so broke. And then,
yeah, I
my
remember
friend
that. I
William Van
remember that.
Wagenen is this great reporter who talked about how the corruption just got so bad,
Yeah,
where to survive, the most powerful guys in the government had to become simply criminal syndicate leaders and whatever. And so they had finally lost all support of the people by the time that the Bin Ladenites broke out of there. But
yeah,
what's going to happen now? I mean, they've already been slaughtering Alawites by the thousands,
yeah,
slaughtering Druze, giving the Israelis a nice excuse to intervene and seize territory in the south and stay. I mean, I
yeah,
don't know if Syria is even going to be a place after this. You know what I mean? I think Israel and Turkey will end up just dividing it up. Maybe
yeah.
America will protect the Kurds out west. I mean, pardon me, out east.
Maybe I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but yeah, it is becoming. I think that we're trying to stand the government up a little bit, but I believe that, I mean, the Golan Heights are gone, right? So that's Israeli territory now, and now I think that the Druze community has always been tied to the Druze community in Syria as to the Druze community in Israel. So they're fortified and backed up by the Israelis and all the soft guys, all the SOCOM guys that are in Israel. The majority of them are Druze, so they're going to be protected by the Israelis, which is an extension of us. But I don't know. I don't know if this government's going to be able to stand up, because I think that I always described what happened in Syria as the Al Qaeda, and really was running all the black markets there, and was a criminal enterprise, and so if you needed supplies, ordnance, or food, they moved from and being ideological to a criminal enterprise, which then getting paid in gold. And so the challenge was is that all those networks are still there, all those mechanisms are still there, and they didn't disappear overnight. And that's part of the reason why ISIS we had that infusion of foreign fighters, and that sort of reflection point where it became ISIS, because when you didn't pay in gold, they had their foreign fighters that hammered you. And so when the Shia militias stopped paying, which were the largest force there, they brought in so many foreign fighters that there ended up being critical mass, and that's how it started spiraling into ISIS. But all of those networks for supply of, like I said, medical supply, food, and all ordnance and all stuff, it's still there. So there's nothing has changed. So I don't know. And it's a lot of it comes from Iraq. A lot of it comes from the Shia community now that's in Iraq, and the different mechanisms in the north through the Kurds and so forth. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think that it's probably going to be a country still in borders, but the borders will be so soft that they'll be essentially protectorates of whomever has control of them.
So what's the relationship between the YPG and Damascus now? I mean, they're just still the Kurds are under American military protection at this point, still, correct?
Well, the Kurds, when they started to go moving towards declaring independence, that was, oh God, about 10 years ago, that really burned the United States government. And so we've had a big problem with supporting them because of that. So they are under our protection, but then you also have the Turkish incursion in 2019, which that completely changed the whole matrix of how we look at the Kurds. So the Kurds have failed to align their foreign policy, align our foreign policy with our national security strategy. They just for some reason they won't do it. So they won't integrate it into the NSS. And so as a result, we keep them at arm's length when it comes to their hold on a minute. Excuse me. I don't know what's going on here. Hold on.
No problem.
Somebody's knocking. So
Is that William Jefferson Clinton on your wall?
yeah.
Got blood dripping from his fangs there.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no, sorry. I'm just okay. Go ahead. Sorry. Sorry about that. I have a guy working on the side of the house, and he's on a ladder, and I thought he fell, but he didn't. He was just he felt compelled to tell me. He felt compelled to tell me something, which has nothing to do with Syria or the Kurds. But the Kurds. So I appreciate you taking a moment. We'll edit it out, or we can keep it in. It doesn't matter. So the Kurdish issue is funny because we don't have since the Turkish invasion or Turkish incursion into the area, to Syria and northern Kurdistan, we pulled out all of our forces. So, and even as comfortable it was to be in Suleiman for someone like you or me.
So they're all just at the Al Tanf base, which is more southeast of Kurdish territory,
Yes,
and
yeah.
they're not embedded with the Kurds anymore.
No, they're not embedded with the Kurds. And then you have like these sort of proxy entities that are with the Kurds. These NGOs, armed NGOs, are with the Kurds. So like FBR, like Free Burma Rangers, and those guys are with the Kurds right now. There's in Erbil, and so those guys have FOBs essentially, and would operate in Syria and operate in all throughout Kurdistan. But like even the Soleimani influence, the Iranian influence is now, I think, the only thing that would be like sovereign would be that would be run by the government at present is Erbil and some of the areas to the south.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
in other words, in northern Iraq, not in Syria at all.
Right. Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's still now it's Talibani who died and Barzani's still alive. Is that right?
yeah. He's still floating around. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean,
And he's still really the ruler of northern Iraq, not the YPG or PKK types, right?
right. Yes. And then if you go to someplace like, so you got like Erbil, and then you got Suleimania, and then you got like a place in the middle called Koya, like a little town in Koya. Like these are all like heavily Iranian. I mean, just embedded Iranian dudes just floating around all over the place. Like it's just not. It's
There's in the Kurdish areas.
In the Kurdish areas, yeah,
uh-huh.
Yeah. So it's heavily heavy Iranian influence, and then you can see the Iranian border. They go and buy carpets. They go and So it's not like it's some kind of animosity. It's there's local economies and there's livelihoods and there's all that stuff going on, which is just
and ever since '03, the Kurds were aligned with the Shiites against the Sunni Arabs in the second and in the third war too, right?
Yes, but there's also a sort of common there's like I said, a livelihood thing going on. Like there's where are you going to go? You're going to go to Baghdad for supplies. You're going to and Baghdad is always in Iraq. It's really strict. Like what's happened is if you want to do your banking, anytime the Kurds go a little bit get out of hand with their banking, with their oil, making money, starting to rebuild, starting to do stuff. Baghdad shuts down their banking, their ability to conduct banking because everything is centralized. So the challenge is like they're not able to conduct commerce, at least legally, if their banking is shut down. And so there's all these strange schemes from 2015 to maybe 2017 to 2020 or 2020, right before COVID, to move currency out and have banking, have like a what do they call those banks? Like a
Koala.
not the wallet system, but actually have like a like a subsidiary banking hub without housing a bank in Kurdistan, so banking could actually happen. And so that was and create, like, move currency out and then have that as being the largest depositor, single depositor
Listen,
in a particular bank.
I would be remiss if I did not ask you what you know about Kurdish oil being sold to the Israelis through Turkey.
Oh well, I mean,
Because
Kurdish.
that's the makeshift, that's the pipeline to Haifa they never got. But this is the kind of
Well,
second
I
phase.
mean, you could just talk about you could talk about the Basra exchange. I mean, I know that's the other side, but that's all Iranian oil. I mean, if you dip test that oil, it's all Iranian oil, and you could tell it's Iranian oil, and it's illegal to sell Iranian oil, but it's all Iraqi oil sold from Basra. It's the same
Yeah,
thing.
no, but talk about Iraqi Kurdish Kirkuk oil, going through Turkey to Israel. Do you know about that?
I do. I know a little bit about it. I mean, I think that yes. So the part of the reason why the Turkish incursion happened was, a lot of people say it was counterterrorism. A lot of it was protectorate, but a lot of it was to create a corridor, get U.S. forces out, evac U.S. forces, evac all humanitarian forces in Syria, and then and then reestablish that corridor to may have a pipeline, not a pipeline, but move oil north into Turkey. And so I was in Kurdistan in 2019 when that happened, and I was spending time making sure that there was obviously that we could establish a humanitarian corridor and evac refugees and so forth. U.S. forces were coming out, and then obviously there was this whole bunch of bananas with El Ain and all these terrorists being ISIS terrorists being let out. But the real thing was that the Turks were trying to establish a safe corridor for petrol, so that they could actually move commodities between the border without being noticed. And that's still going on, as far as I know. But that was a huge part of it. I mean, imagine you had American forces, NATO forces fighting against NATO forces. I mean, the Turks were shelling U.S. positions, and it was crazy. It was, and then on top of that, then you had the Russians coming in, and then everybody talks about our fight with the Russians, but there wasn't really a fight with the Russians. The fight was really with the Turks, because we couldn't evacuate fast enough out of there. In the same respect, there was a huge amount of there was a plan within a plan, and a lot of it had to do with commerce, and a lot of it had to do with the purchase of petrol. But the biggest thing was the moving of currency. So the moving of currency to a safe bank, so that, and there was contractors that came in with planes and loaded that currency in, and then brought it all up to three different locations, but one of them was in Turkey, so that they could conduct banking, so that they could conduct commerce without relying on Baghdad. And that system, I think, is still there. So you have, like, you set up a satellite ATM in Kurdistan, and a satellite office where you're conducting banking, but all that stuff those papers get transferred to a bank in a foreign country, so you can actually start making the purchases you need to make, and you can actually guarantee the stuff that's happening. And that's kind of what that did happen. Yes, if that's what that's the short answer. Sorry. But yeah,
fascinating history, man.
But you had planes coming in, and with contractors, armed dudes, and they were just loading currency in. And they said, look, if you're going to do it, then you need to deposit funds. And so and it was X amount of funds, and so they moved like $4 billion of currency in a matter of hours. And once those planes were up in the air, I hope there's a lot of trust when it comes to where they go and what happens. But that was how the Kurds got out of being under the thumb of Baghdad's, where they could pull their banking certificate at any time and shut down their economy. And so that was a benefit of that that incursion, which in the same respect, there's some question of whether or not the Kurds in Turkey had a hand in negotiating that. But Barzani is the guy who's in charge of everything. So,
All right. Well, look, as long as we're on this, let me ask you this, because I know a reporter. I got contrary information, believe me, going way back to the days. I covered it all at the time. But I got a guy now who's got a revisionist take that says that Barzani was always the power behind Al Qaeda in Iraq. That the worst of the vanguard of the Sunni insurgency, the bin Ladenites, were always, and if you think about it, Zarqawi was safe and sound in Kurdistan before the war, where Bush would not let the military kill him before the war started because he needed that talking point to try to pretend that he was in Iraq, get it, as though he was under the protection of Saddam Hussein, when really he was under the protection of Masoud Barzani. And then my guy says, and I'll tell you, it's William Van Wagenen who wrote this incredible new book. You might be able to see it behind me here. Creative Chaos, brand new, out by the Institute.
I love
Is
that.
about the dirty war and the origins of the dirty war in Syria there. And he covered Iraq War II there. He was kidnapped by Al Qaeda for a time there. He's spent an inordinate amount of time with the Yazidis and with the Iraqi Kurds. And you know what I mean? He's not bluffing because he read something. He's a real badass. And he told me that the Yazidis were the ones who convinced him that Al Qaeda in Iraq was always a front for Barzani. And they clearly were operating together in some circumstances when, like, for example, Al Qaeda in Iraq in '07 did a big suicide attack on the Yazidis. And then the Kurds came in right after them and mopped them up and stole all of their stuff and whatever. And it was clearly like the Kurds using the bin Ladenite suicide bombers as shock troops in their advance and that kind of thing. So, but that of course would require a lot of rewriting Iraq War II and the whole history of that. And look, I know that America's allies, the Saudis, were backing Zarqawi against American forces and the Shiites that whole time. And even the NSC and the CIA, at least a few different times, complained about it to the Washington Post. But right, they're accusing their own friends, the Saudis, very against interests, and it seemed those seemed like very like sincere frustrations. But then I never heard anything like that back in the days of the war. But I don't write William Van Wagenen off at all either. But so you seem to know so much about this. I wanted to see what.
I don't know. I mean, I know what I was involved in, right? So I know where I was at the time and what I was doing. So that's kind of like my disclaimer. Sometimes a lot of stuff is not my circus, not my monkeys, or sometimes I was involved in things I'm not even sure why we were doing it, but I was there. I think I would go back to a couple of different things. So I think Van Wagen, I don't think he's off. I would argue that what's a great way of describing it? The Taliban who took over Afghanistan are not foreigners; they're Afghans.
Sure.
Right. So let's just start off with like maybe that. Let's just take that component. So I'm an American, right? I'm of Afghan descent. I know a lot of ghetto Pashto or Farsi, and I know a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But I remember when I was there, everyone talked about the good old days when the vigilantes were in charge. They talked about the Taliban, and everything was safe, and you could walk around, and there was no corruption, right? So I'm kind of going to bring that sort of concept to this conversation. You first of all, if you want anything, so we'll go backwards, go forwards. If you want anything, Al Qaeda is they're the guys you go to. A third of Al Qaeda is the old guard. There's not many of them left. A third of them are sort of trying to rebrand themselves, align themselves with other entities ideologically. But the last third is a criminal enterprise. And maybe now it's much more than that. It's maybe 50 or 60% better, the criminal enterprises. That criminal enterprise is everybody does. And if you want anything, you got to do business with them. And they do business with them. And so the Kurds are masters at doing business with everyone around them while they're fighting them, in big air quotes. Right. So the Turks, the Syrians, the Iranians. And so when it comes to the ISIS, I I know a little bit about the Yazidis, these fortified towns, and how they used to be perceived um, by the Iraqis in general, but also the Kurds. And the Yazidis, this is going to sound like I'm besmirching them, but the Yazidis were isolated communities. They didn't let a lot of people in, and they were a very proud warrior culture. So, you come near our towns, we don't know you, we don't want you in, that's it. And so there was a huge bit of payback going on when it came to to ISIS, when ISIS was in the region. And the Kurds, I think, were all too happy to collaborate with adverse forces that would then hammer the Yazidis, and they would come in as saviors. They have a very, very long history of assimilating other cultures into their culture so that they can demonstrate sort of lineage and legitimacy. They did that with the Assyrian community, right? The Assyrians are their own cultural, ethnic, and linguistic group, and the Assyrians they've indigenized their culture into their culture, right? So that their Assyrian history shows that they go back all the way. And they're a distinctly different group than the Kurds, and so I would say that in short, Van Wagen, if I was going to give you a short answer, bottom line up front is there are instances, I think, where that was happening. I think there was collaboration. If you look at different battle plans and how ISIS moved in the region, they were always conveniently not engaging the Kurds.
Can you talk timeframes here? Because my question was originally about Iraq War II era. It sounds like you're more referring to the Caliphate era, or maybe not. And I'm
Yeah,
not saying, and I
I'm
think
post
William may
Caliphate.
be also talking about both. But
Yeah.
just if you could be a little more
So I was
specific.
talking about the Caliphate era. I was talking about the
Okay,
Caliphate
yeah.
era. Yeah, I'm talking about, and so, when it comes to Iraq War II, I think that the parties involved, I think, uh, I think, was he in charge of ISIS? I don't know if he was in charge of ISIS, but I would say he's more like a board member, because that's kind of how it was run. There were interested parties that were toying with the idea of arming and disarming and movements, and there were operations of convenience that happened at that time. So I don't think Van Wagen's off during Iraq too. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But the Caliphate era, that's different. That's
Yeah.
completely different.
Well, listen, by the way, you'll love his book, man. It is so
I'll have
good.
to look
It
at it.
is the best. I've read a lot of books about Syria. I mean, not a lot, like, but a lot. And
Right.
his is the best for
Yeah.
sure on the origins of that war.
I'll have to
Yeah.
look at. I'll take a look at it. I mean, like I said, I was just involved. Involved in different elements, so I
Do
can
you
speak.
have a book or do you write articles?
I write articles, I'm in the middle of writing a book about my memoirs of the different areas that I was involved in and so forth. But and I'm happy to chat with you about it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, cool.
yeah.
Um,
So
definitely make sure and send links. Email me your stuff. I'll sign up for your Substack or whatever it is and try to keep
yeah,
it.
yeah. I think I like, maybe I'll stop recording. We'll do that. Why don't we do that? Um, so.